Hey, shalom and welcome to Wisdom and Torah Ministries. Did you know? Hey, did you know that the book of Corinthians, chapters 11, in regards to a woman covering her head or uncovering her head, or a man prophesying or praying in public has absolutely nothing to do to the Jewish way of life of the synagogue service? Something to look into. We're going to examine that today. Now, I'm going to ask you to to please allow me the privilege and the honor to state my case without you having to freak out and start like arguing with me and throwing stuff against the screen because I dare talk about Corinthians chapters 11. All I'm going to ask you is, please let me share my heart. I've been doing this research with the WIT Talmudim team. We have Daniel, we have Ryan, we have Tyler, we have Matthew Vanderels, we have a whole bunch of people who are studying with us, and I presented a lot of the stuff to them and say, hey, let's study this together because there's a huge disconnect within the Hebraic roots understanding, and we use a lot of chapters 11 of the book of Corinthians to create a division about whether or not people should cover their heads or not. Now, personally, I like to cover my head when I teach. That's where I'm at today. But what did it mean back then in the time of Paul under Corinthian culture or under Roman Empire? And what were the laws of Rome in regards to a woman covering her head or not? What would they do to a woman, when they caught her in adultery in the Roman Empire? What was the law according to that? Many of us never really think about the context of these things. We assume that Paul is just trying to be anti-Jewish everything, that we don't want to do everything that Israel does. Ladies and gentlemen, the Torah talks about in the temple that the priests had to cover their heads. So obviously, men covering their hair, praying and prophesying is not dealing with the priests in the temple because they're not dealing with that in Corinth. They are in Corinth. Asia Minor, that is in Greece, a Roman colony. So what is really the context here? Is it talking about a kippah? I don't think it's talking about the kippah, and that's what we're going to looking into. Now, the argument is not whether or not you need to wear kippah or not. Please understand that. The argument, we want to completely keep it narrow to the context of what the text actually is referring to, not because of our assumptions or what we think it means in regards or against what the Jewish people do in Israel. Okay, can we be honest? Is that making sense? I have my friends Michael here. I messed up your name, Michael. Michael from Torah Restoration Down Under Ministries. He invited me to Australia. We're having a great time. Really, really, really great human being. Him and his family, and he is here with me. I'm in his house. He's lent me one of the rooms so I could do this for you guys. So let's get right into the teaching. Okay. All right. Did you know the context of 1 Corinthians chapters 11, verse 1 to verse 10? So let's read them. Okay. Watch this. It says, "Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things that keep the traditions that I have delivered them to you. And I want you to know that I am the head, that the head of every man is Messiah, the head of every woman is man, and the head of Messiah is Elohim." So what we have here is the language of a hierarchy, hierarchy language. Quite simple, straight up, very well understood in the first century. Now, verse 4 forward is when we get in all these arguments and all this trouble. So let's examine it. Utilizing archaeology, anthropology, and historical evidence to put into a better context, the context of what Paul is trying to convey to the people in Corinth. Because they're living under Roman law, they're living under a caste system of Rome, they're living under imperial rule. So therefore, they're not living in the Western Hemisphere. They're living in the Eastern, culture. All right. So verse 4, it says, "And every man prophesying and praying, having his head covered, dishonor his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered, dishonor her head. For that is the one and the same as if her head was shaved." Now, notice though, and that's another teaching in itself, that Paul says, but every woman who prays or prophesies. So I guess women were allowed to do stuff in the congregation. Right? They had a voice. But how do you do it? Do you do it according to the way the Romans did it? Or you did it according to the way you want to do it? You do it according to the proper, modest way. So obviously here, ladies and gentlemen, in the Roman Empire, a man praying with his head covered or prophesying in public. Well, Rico, what does this have anything to do with what we do now? Ladies and gentlemen, in the first century, the Jewish people, they were exempt. They were exempt from, doing worship of the cultural, what do you call it, imperial cult. They were exempt from doing certain things and take part of some of the pagan practices, okay? And the Jews were also exempt from going to the temples of the pagans. They were allowed to practice in their synagogues. The law only gave them the right to worship in their synagogues. So they were in their synagogues, in private, away from the society, praying and covering their head when they pray, like all the Jews do when they put the talit over their heads. In every synagogue all over the world for the last 2,000 years, nothing has changed. So obviously, what is the context here? Notice, the main issue here is praying and prophesying in public. So clearly there's got to be something going on here. So let me take you to a resource that I have, and I want to show you, and I want to read a little bit on the commentary so we can get a greater understanding of context from historical perspectives. Okay, so let's go right there. Now, I'm reading from Roman to Philemon, Sundervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds Commentary, Volume 3. Okay, now in reference to the verses mentioned here, we're talking about the head of every man is Messiah, and the head of every woman is a man, and the head is and the head of Messiah is Elohim. Okay, so when we read that verse, okay, right in here, we read the verse, but I want you to understand that Messiah, we already read that. But what does it mean, ladies and gentlemen? It says, clearly it's talking in the language of a husband and a wife. But when you go to verse 4, it says, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonor his head. Notice, it's about honor and shame. So I want to read from this commentary here because I think it's very important to what we're going to talk about. And I want you to see of that relief in the bottom of that, of the scenery of a emperor of Rome. And what would he do when he would pray and offer sacrifices to his gods in public? Okay, now notice, remember, they're in Corinth. They're in the middle of a pagan imperial cult. They used to worship other gods, So now it says, the covering of the man's head was called capite velato. That's what it was called in Latin. Okay, so it was practice. How? It was commonplace in Roman religious cult. One explanation was that it helped to reduce the noise of the animals being sacrificed according to their understanding. But the statue of Augustus, which was a Roman emperor, displayed at Corinth, showed the emperor with his head covered. Similar iconography is found in the frieze of Ada Passis, which is the altar of peace that he dedicated at Rome. What does it mean? The social elite, this is really interesting, the social elite took an active part in the religious cult of the city by serving as priests. And thus, those who had joined the congregation may have introduced this Roman cultural norm into the worship in the early assembly. So now what we have, the real problem there, it was not even the kippah, or covering the head like the Jews. Ladies and gentlemen, we have completely misunderstood that verse, and we have completely judged our brother in Israel. And now a lot of people in the Hebraic roots movement or any kind of Hebrew roots understanding or whatever, we become really judgmental about whoever wants to cover their head when they want to pray or whatever. Look, if they are mature enough that they want to, be more observant, so be it. What's the problem? See, we know that the kippah is not necessarily a commandment, but it was a head covering for the priest, and that is a commandment. All right? And therefore, so what happens is that now in Corinth, it's not talking about the head covering of the Jews. It's talking about the way that the Romans used to worship their gods. And Paul is trying to convey the message, if you do this in public and you pray and you prophesy, when they see you, they will assume that you are worshiping the gods of Rome, that you're not worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because you cannot mix the holy and the profane, the common and the clean. Get it? That's what the context is all about here in this perspective. So let's continue here, because I really want you to see more of this. I think it's important. Okay, are you enjoying it? All right, let's go. So now, you see, talk is cheap. We need to show you the proof. Remember, verify everything I say. Do not believe anything I say. So now what we have here, now we have the elite. They're worshiping as priests. Everybody was a priest now. Got it? And they're worshiping in the manner of the Roman culture and the imperial worship. Thus, that was a blasphemy to the God of Israel because you did things differently in the temple. Okay? That's why the Torah says you should only worship the Lord where the God has chosen, not just anywhere. There were 176 imperial altars in Asia Minor. And there were over 174 imperial temples. Asia Minor alone. We're not talking about the whole Roman Empire. So now, watch. That's the image that I was telling you. If you look from your left to the right, the third person there, the second person in the front, you see the veil. That was Augustus, the emperor. He is covering his head when he's going to give offerings to his God. Okay, so should we worship the God of Israel in the manner of the pagans? Absolutely not. So now that lends the issue of the next question. So now we already answered that question. So now we got the problem of a woman covering her head. Oh my, this is such an argument amongst people all over the place. Why? Because they say, well, I don't need to cover my head. Women say that. Or some people say, well, I need to cover my head. Look, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm only going to show you the evidence today. I'm not here to try to tell you that you're wrong or you're right, whatever. But I'm going to show you the context of what Paul was talking about it when he wrote it. That way we can better make a better judgment and stop jumping all over each other, judging one another, instead of understanding the context from the time frame and the context of the time that Paul gave those things to the people of the correction. All right, so watch this. In verse 5, it says, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled disgraces her head. It is one and the same thing as having her head shaved. So there's two different things here. Shaving the head of a woman represented something, and unveiling or veiling represented something. Okay, so let me read you the commentary. It says, notice that Paul clearly envisages the woman should be involved in prayer and prophesy in the fellowship. So he's not eliminating for women to be involved, but the context and how she's supposed to look like when she does it. So obviously, just like covering your head in public for a man was dishonoring because it represented worshiping to other gods. So obviously in Roman culture, unveiling yourself in public has also a meaning of dishonor. So let's look right into it. The hairstyles of the women in the imperial family of Rome tended to set the trend for women in the rest of the empire. It is clear from the portrait of coins and the sculpture that women's hair in the middle of the first century tended to be longer than under Augustus. Agrippa the Younger, the wife of the Emperor Claudius, and the mother of the future Emperor Nero from a previous marriage, adopted a hairstyle where the hair was braided and gathered in a long loop. In other words, there's a whole kinds of stuff here. Okay? But I want to guide you towards the latter part of that paragraph. The covering of the head is an emblem found in sculptural representations in the late Republic and under Augustus, where the pala, a pala was a long rectangular type of garment that represented modesty. Watch this. Where the pala is pulled over the top of the head. This became an emblem for modesty and chastity. Presumably, women who felt able to uncover their heads were considered immodest, unchaste, and therefore, by definition, un-Roman. Okay, so in the first century, that means something. It says, if a woman does not cover her head, she should have cut off her hair and shave it off, right? Isn't that what it says? If it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or shaved off, she should cover her head. Okay, now, with that being said, I want to read to you from this book that I have. Okay, it's called Roman Wives and Roman Widows by Bruce Winters. All right, it's a really, really good book. I highly recommend it. And I want to tell you a little bit about the laws of Rome. See, in the laws of Rome, a woman wore a palla, which was a big rectangular garment that shows her modesty and chastity. So if she would uncover her head, and one particular historian, he quoted that a woman did not really want to be married anymore. So what did she do? She uncovered her head 3 straight days, thus sending shame to herself and her husband, and therefore giving him grounds for divorce, so he would divorce her. Okay, so that meant a lot. That meant something. Prostitutes would never cover their heads in the ancient Roman Empire. Strange women never cover their heads in ancient prostitutes or women of elite status who were like feminists, modern day feminists, they were of elite status in the Roman Empire, they would not cover their hair as a sign of rebellion. in the Roman Empire, okay? So it was an act of shame back then. So I'm not telling women now whether they're going to cover their heads or not. I'm just giving you history so we will stop all the argument about stuff we're not really researching. In this context, ladies and gentlemen, is getting out of hand. You know, people are arguing and separating congregations and dividing one another. And how many of us have ever studied imperial worship? How many of you of us ever studied the role of women in the Roman Empire? How many of you have ever studied, you know, what happened to an adulteress and how they made her dress and what did they do to her hair when she was accused or found guilty of adultery? See, all these things are very important for us to find out. Let's continue. It says, how did the dress of a modest woman differ from that of modest women, or modest wife? Two bronze statues found in the house of Herculaneum are now located in the Museum of Classical Archaeology, University of Cambridge. They portray two dancing girls who wear no veils or mantles. One, in fact, is depicted undoing her dress so as to expose her shoulder and part of her breast. These clearly struck to convey the exact opposite of modest wife. In keeping with the double standards of Roman society, these women were dressed in different and not Roman attire to convey the idea of promiscuity by portraying them as foreign rather than Roman women. Okay? Did you know that in the first century, saying that you are a Corinthian girl was not a compliment? In the first century, the Romans had an expression for a prostitute. She is a Corinthian girl. So now, the problem in Corinthians, if Paul sees women prophesying or praying in public with their head covered, then he is saying, might as well shave your hair off, because they're going to treat you as a prostitute. They're going to treat you as someone who has no honor. They're going to treat you as someone who does not value her husband. And that's why the whole chapter is about order and the hierarchy in the heavens, not to minimize the role of women, because clearly they were prophesying and clearly they were praying. He was saying to protect their honor, to protect them from the perception by the Roman culture that the women who worship the God of Israel, they worship him like the Roman people do. Thus, that means that there's no honor in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Paul is bringing correction so that we will know how to present ourselves in a pagan culture, how to do it in a manner that would honor God and not send a message of dishonor. Okay? Now, I'm going to read a few things here. It says, I'm going to read something right here that I found that, like always, when I need it, I can't get it. 1 Corinthians 11:5 itself provides an explanation of the significance of removing the marriage veil. It is one of the same, okay, as to having your head shaved. Dio Chrysostom records that Fortune was sometimes blamed for emotional weakness and cites Medea in this regard because of her sexual passion for Jason. Dio noted, a woman guilty of adultery shall shave her hair off according to the law and play the prostitute. So there was a Roman law that considered a woman with her hair cut off as a prostitute. They will make them wear a different type of garment. They will make her shave their hair off. So Paul, what is he saying then? He's saying, listen, in our culture, in the Roman culture in Corinth, a woman who is modest, she will wear a pala, a rectangular garment to cover her completely that will not get the attention. And we're not talking about the Muslim garments that look all like this, okay? We're talking about something different. And it says, but if you prophesy and you pray in public with your hair uncovered, then what it means, according to what the perception is, and the honor and shame society, that you are a prostitute. And that you, in the first century, it meant, in Corinthians, it meant that you're not honoring your husband. And Paul is saying, if you're going to walk around with your hair uncovered, might as well shave off your hair, because according to Roman law, if a woman committed adultery, that was the penalty of adultery, getting her hair shaved off. So what is really the issue, ladies and gentlemen, in Corinthians chapter 11? Is it an objection to everything Jewish? Or is it an objection to the Roman way of life in regards to the way they used to worship their gods? You decide. So go back and take a look at this information, verify everything we say, and I pray that it is a blessing to you, that we can grow and that we can learn, always learning something new, always learning how to please, how to praise, how to uplift, how to honor the Father who sits on the throne. Amen? May Yahweh bless you and keep you. We'll see you guys soon. Shalom.